Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we are honored to have Carl Bernstein here with us tonight. A couple of bits of housekeeping. The restrooms down the hall once more. Please make sure your cell phones are on silent. We're going to open up to audience questions in about halfway through the discussion. Please make sure to raise your hand, wait for Mr. Axelrod to call on you, and then please make sure you wait for this microphone that I'm holding to come to you. We're recording this, so we want to make sure that your question is recorded. Now, to formally introduce our speaker is Jake Gosselin. He's the managing editor of The Gate at the Institute of Politics.
When one thinks of Carl Bernstein, one invariably thinks of Watergate, perhaps the greatest demonstration of the power good journalism has to protect and maintain our democracy. And yet, considering Watergate alone would be a disservice to Mr. Bernstein's remarkable career, a career which began at 16 as a copy boy for the Washington Star. After dropping out of the University of Maryland a few years later, he would begin his tenure at the Elizabeth Daily Journal in New Jersey, which would eventually lead him to the Metro staff of the Washington Post by age 22. The rest is, well, history. Since Watergate, Mr. Bernstein worked as a senior correspondent with ABC News, covered the run-up to the Gulf War for Time magazine, and published 5 best-selling books, the most recent being a critically acclaimed profile of former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Through it all, he would demonstrate time and time again his ability to investigate rigorously, write prolifically, and report courageously, abilities which have become his trademark. Tonight's moderator, David Axelrod, similarly had his start in a newsroom, joining the Chicago Tribune straight out of college, before leaving to pursue a career as a political consultant, a career which would eventually result in the election of former President Barack Obama. What is perhaps most remarkable as a 21st century student is that the skills these men share, skills which built up a president and brought another down, were not taught in a classroom, but learned in a newsroom. In that spirit, I hope tonight can be a similar learning experience from 2 men who have worked in Washington with integrity, bravery, and class. It is my distinct honor to present to you Carl Bernstein and David Axelrod.
Thanks, Jake. And to all of you, and I want to, just a few matters I want to deal with right away. First of all, I want to congratulate you on, you still have a great head of hair. That means something to me for obvious reasons. Secondly, I want to say to all you students that there were certain things that may have been confusing in that film. Those things that Carl and Bob were working on, those were called typewriters. And that was, you actually put words on paper then, not on computer. And those phones there, those rotary phones, that they don't exist anymore. In fact, I have to tell you that once we sent my son over to someone's house when he was a little boy. We said, call us when you get there. And he got there, and he never called. And we called and said, why don't you call? And they had sent him to the back room, and there was a rotary phone, and he didn't know how to use it. So I thought of that when I was watching the film. So the idea of a plot like this seems so fantastical that you wonder how such a thing could happen. Thank God it's part of the past. But I want to ask you a few questions just about your own experience, because you mentioned you were the Virginia editor for the Post, and
Chief Virginia correspondent.
Chief Virginia correspondent, okay, and you were a relatively young reporter, although you started when you were 16. Woodward was relatively new, as was noted in the paper. And little by little, you thought you were covering a police story, and now you're covering a story that goes right to the Oval Office. What were the phases of? At what point did you realize, holy smokes, we're into something completely different here than I imagined?
Very early. Obviously, there's the scene in the movie where I find the check and Woodward, and then we make the connection. of the check to the burglars, et cetera, and to the committee for the re-election of the president. So right away, what was amazing, in fact, was that the Nixon White House and Nixon Campaign Committee were so successful for so long in defying logic and getting away with it, in saying, oh no, we don't have anything to do with this. Even as we kept writing stories, and New York Times, Cy Hirsch in the New York Times writing stories, some in Time magazine, that indicated, of course, this has ties to the Nixon campaign. But the secret fund, once we found out about the secret fund, and one by one who controlled it, then we began to have a real idea of the dimensions of this. And every day, Woodward and I would sit in a little vending machine room off the newsroom floor about this size, and there'd be a vending machine, coffee machine right here. And we were about to do the Mitchell story that you saw tonight. And I put a dime in the coffee machine, and I literally felt the hair on the back of my neck felt like a chill went down my spine. And I turned to Woodward and I said, oh my God, this president is going to be impeached. And Woodward looked at me and he said, oh my God, you're right. And we can never use that word impeachment around this newsroom because somebody here might have an idea that we have an agenda. And we did not, except what we've come to call the best obtainable version of the truth, and get out there whatever that was the best obtainable version of the truth. But somehow there was this flash that I just had that day, and it was months before people started talking about impeachment, but this thing has got to go to Nixon. It's just too logical.
Yeah.
And Mitchell had been the president's campaign manager. He had been his law partner. He had been the Attorney General of the United States. And so that, to me, just suddenly impeachment.
You mentioned when we were waiting to come out here that you guys approach this as essentially as police reporters would, just following the trail. But the difference between doing police reporting is you don't have the White House and high public officials denigrating your story. They called it a third-rate burglary when it started. Those pressures are unusual for a reporter. And the stakes of getting it, if you're a good reporter, you always worry about getting something wrong.
That's always the fear. I mean, you know it. The real fear is making a mistake. You asked me in there, were we scared during that scene at the end of the movie? I think we were kind of hyperventilating that night more than being scared. And earlier, very early on, there had been a time when I had what I thought at the time was a kind of irrational fear, right around the time of the Mitchell story. And right before it was going, the night it ran, I came home, and the other thing is we were both, I was 28, Woodward was 29 at the beginning of all this. We were both divorced. So we had time, and we worked at night. And you see, almost all the real reporting takes place at night. And I came home after that Mitchell story, and I got scared. The only time I ever remembered there's one other time really getting scared, and physically scared. And it had to do with what Mitchell had said to me on the phone. And it's one of the few...
Mrs. Graham.
About Mrs. Graham, but really about, he said, we're going to do a little story on YouTube, boys, when this is over. And it's one of the few things in the movie that strikes me as not as it happened, because the voice of Mitchell was very different than what you hear, and it was really threatening. And it was terrifying. And so that night, and I remembered then that we had some information that Gordon Liddy, one of the Watergate burglars, one of the two chief burglars, we knew that he had, I think by then we knew that he had threatened to kill a reporter, Jack Anderson. And I just said, I want to get out of the house. And I called somebody and did not stay at home.
Gordon Liddy was a famously sort of off-kilter character.
Yeah. But anyway, so to your point, long-winded, but so the real fear, though, generally is of making a mistake.
Yeah.
And rather than the physical fear, because you knew what the stakes were after a while, and that if you made a mistake, you could bring this whole institution down, given what was going on. And thank God, you know, when we wrote All the President's Men, even when the movie was made, and you don't see Katharine Graham, the great publisher of the Washington Post, in the movie, because her extraordinary courage and bravery and supporting Bradley and supporting us really is central to what happened.
One of the obviously one of the great fascinations for decades was who was your source, who was Deep Throat, because Deep Throat plays such a big role in your reporting, in your book. Hal Holbrook, great character in the movie, and you managed to keep that secret for a very long time.
As we said, we didn't tell either of our ex-wives, our subsequent ex-wives, who it was. Or
who did know? You and Bradley? And
just Woodward and I, and after Watergate was over, we told Bradley. But during Watergate, Bradley did not know that it was Mark Felt. But the whole story,
who was the deputy director of the FBI?
He was the deputy director of FBI. But the whole thing, again, the Mark Felt piece kind of grew like Topsy in a way that we never expected. We put it in the book. These meetings were dramatic because of all moving a flower pot as a signal and meeting in an underground garage. But basically what Felt did was confirm information that we had obtained elsewhere. And he did not, up until the end, as you see, he did not win. Woodward said, I'm tired of your chicken shit games. You know, he wouldn't tell us what he knew. But he did confirm things that made us certain that we were right. And that was so important. But when we wrote the book, we didn't expect that this would become a great piece of folklore. So then, when the movie came out, and it became, in a way, a dramatic centerpiece, and then, of course, he was still, nobody knew the big secret, you know, it went on for 30 years. Nobody knew his identity except us. So it grew, and the myth of Felt grew and grew and grew. And it's important to understand, though, because there's all this talk today about leaks and one thing and another. You can see that the Watergate reporting was not about leaks. Nobody was coming up to us and saying, hey, guys, here's the information. It was really about a methodical kind of figuring out who do you go see, basic reporting, the most elemental kind of reporting that you do. Logic. Don't go see these people in the daytime where they work. Nobody's going to tell you anything. Use common sense. Go out at night. Get a lot of doors slammed in your face. Eat a lot of McDonald's hamburgers.
The key is to get divorced before you start an investigation.
That's right.
So, but the reason I raised Felt is because you are reliant at times. I mean, your newspaper needed assurance. You needed assurance, and so these stories may not have appeared, despite all your hard work, if you could not have verified it at a high enough level. Did you ever have any concern about his motivation, or about his reliability?
No, I didn't. I did not have any. Once I knew that he was the deputy director of the FBI and what the information he was seeing, and also there's some things he said that just weren't right. Also, that turned out not to be true. not by deceit or anything like that. He just had some information. You even see a little bit of it, and it's kind of arcane in the movie. That he says a couple things there that turned out not to be exactly right.
All right, so let's get to the elephant in the room, which is
Orange hair? This is the orange-haired elephant?
there is. I mean, no one could watch this film and not.
I was amazed myself.
Be-
I mean, I hadn't seen it, and I just saw
Be
snatches
reminded
of it.
you know, the White House denials are certainly.
Well, Nixon tried to make the conduct of the press the issue in Watergate from the beginning, and he got other people to help him on it, just as Trump has tried to make first the press and now Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. But Trump has made more than anything the conduct of the press the issue in his presidency, not just about Russia, but generally speaking. The enemy of the people hasn't consistently been ISIS. It's been the press, and of course the phrase itself has a terrible history associated with tyranny and worse.
Yes, there's that element of it. There's also the element of how the public. I was struck in the film when Bradley said to you, I assume he actually did say it, that half the country hasn't even heard of Watergate. You know, nobody gives a shit. There is this issue of how much people, you know, there's a fascination among some about this Russia thing, but there's a sense that others are not interested. How much of a concern was that of yours, that this was falling on deaf ears, that it wasn't making a difference? That
did not really, you know, we really saw our job as trying to find out what's happened here. And the movie, more than the book, much more than the book, is focused on the first few months. It ends there when Nixon
Yes.
takes the oath of office for a second term. And remember, he won by the greatest landslide in history in that election. But
being a candidate that he worked very hard to help.
Well, let's talk about that parallel, because what Watergate was about, on the most basic level, was a vast campaign of political espionage and sabotage to undermine the democratic electoral process in this country, to not have a free election. They tried to determine, the Nixon White House, who Nixon would run against in the Republican Party through the kinds of things Segretti was talking about there. And I, for the first time when I watched the movie now, and I looked at the various concocting fake letters, it's like what happened with the Russians, concocting fake social media postings. Similar kind of thing. Just as the Russians in the current instance tried to undermine our free electoral system, here we had the President of the United States trying to do it. And if the allegations and assertions about Trump are true in terms of, quote, collusion with Russia, then you also have the candidate for President of the United States willing to undermine the most basic of our democratic processes, which is free elections. But that's what really, yes, there were other horrible abuses of power by Richard Nixon. They're referred to in the movie about the things done in the names of national security at the end, wiretappings, break-ins, use of the IRS against Nixon's enemies. You hear it all on the tapes. What we know now, of course, is that the Nixon presidency was a criminal presidency from its first days until Nixon resigned because of all of these activities. But really, what was most significant was a president of the United States who was willing to undermine this most basic of our freedoms.
Can I just
to
ask you
have
an aside? Just as a personal question about your own orientation.
Stop me when I go on, because I kind of go
No,
like
that's right.
that sometimes.
I don't think anybody's objecting. You, in your own background, you saw the sort of destructive power of government in your own life. Your parents were subjected to the scrutiny of the FBI because of their politics and their...
What he's getting at is my parents were serious left-wing people in the McCarthy era, and were the subject of lots of investigations. I wrote a memoir about it, based to a large extent on my parents' FBI files, which are about this high. But we were wiretapped. The house was wiretapped.
They surveilled your bar mitzvah.
There was, yes, the FBI. The
If you want to hear his Torah portion, you can find it in the FBI file.
My father, who was actually an atheist, said, "Don't be bar mitzvah," and he was right.
The reason I ask you this, and of course Richard Nixon was a McCarthyist in the sense of he was a big red baiter in that era and so on. But my question to you was, did that cause in you a sense of skepticism about government, about the power of government, and maybe about Nixon himself?
The funny thing is that through all of it, I had, toward the end of it, I had empathy for Nixon, and afterwards empathy for Nixon, because I think there are aspects of Nixon being a tragic figure, whatever his criminality. But I certainly...
wrote a book called The Final Days that captured some of it.
Yeah, and I certainly think that my knowing about the excesses of government misuse of surveillance, that kind of misuse of governmental power, I'm sure I had a sensitivity to it. But it did not, it did not.
I'm not asking whether you went after Nixon because you were resentful about the way you're.
But I do think never occurred to me.
But I think that being sort of iconoclastic, being suspicious of the misuse of power, may be a useful impulse as you approach a story like this, because you have to be able to believe that the president, the government is capable of doing these things.
It did, again, until we got to the secret fund and what it paid for, and then especially when we got to the Segretti story and it made sense and pulled it all together, that it was about undermining the electoral process. It didn't make sense even to us, because the common wisdom at the time was, well, why would Nixon be involved in all these dirty tricks? What for? He was going to win the election. It didn't make sense. So that part of it, there was not any predisposition at all to think this is about necessarily excess of governmental power. The question was, yeah, this stuff was happening. Why was it happening?
So one of the things that you and I, we looked at each other when we were watching the movie, when the Mark Feld character and the Deep Throat character says about investigations, you build from the outer edges and go step by step. So let me ask you about the events of this week. Because we had the first indictments and the first plea in the Mueller investigation. How do you interpret those as someone who's been involved in reporting on such things for a very long time, and through the prism of this experience, how do you view what we just saw? Is this the beginning? Does it give you a sense of where it's going? What does it tell you?
All of the above. Holbrook in the movie pretty much lays it out, the Deep Throat character, how you build this kind of case. You begin with the little Segrettis, the little Papadopouloses, That does not mean, look, we still have a long way to go here in terms of knowing what did the president, this orange-haired president, know, and what when did he know it? We don't know yet. However, we know from the events of the weekend and the indictments that Papadopoulos, in this one, you see the salivating for the information about Hillary Clinton from the Russians by many people without any concern, apparently, that it's a foreign power that they want this information from. So there's a willingness to go along
And not just any
with,
foreign power,
and not
but
just any, exactly,
foreign power.
right, exactly. So you see that, and you see the salivating for this information, and Papadopoulos is telling Manafort about it. It's clear that one of the people in there is Manafort, and he's the campaign manager. So you got to ask yourself, well, who would Manafort talk to about this? I don't know. So logic.
Seems like someone may ask him that.
Logic goes a certain way, but there also this whole question of collusion, intent. You can't draw too many parallels here, or too many. There are parallels, particularly the conduct of the press, particularly the willingness of the President of the United States or the candidate for president Trump has a history of contempt for the law and contempt for norms. So you got to look at that as well. But I think the answer to your.
So you think this is just the beginning?
Oh, I don't think there's any question of that, but it does not. Look, remember Iran-Contra as well, where you similarly had building a case from the bottom up, but it did not definitively go to the President of the United States, and certainly with the President of the United States having intent to break laws, to do horrible things. So I think we got to be a little cautious here.
Yeah.
I think we got to really see where this goes, and at the same time, we also know we're dealing with a situation that here's a real, this is worse than Watergate in many, many ways, in the sense that we have a President of the United States who lies about almost anything. This is not me talking, this is repertorially responsible to say it and report it. It's very different than Nixon. Nixon lied situationally to avoid criminal being trapped, responsibility. We're dealing with a President of the United States that can't seem to summon any ability to be truthful about the most basic of matters. This is a very different person in presidency than Nixon and the Nixon presidency. Nixon was a capable man in many regards. What I keep, and you've heard me on the air many times, saying that what's so astonishing to me in the last few months is the number of Republicans on the Hill who have said to me privately, as well as people in the top military command and the intelligence community, who say he's unstable, the President of the United States. It's the first thing they say. And he's unfit. You would not have heard that about Richard Nixon.
Yeah, the key thing you're saying, though, is that they say it to you privately.
Well, that's exactly right.
But let me ask you this. Is this a parallel? Because the fact of the matter is that the Republican Party was pretty unified behind Richard Nixon at the time that this movie ended. Now, but over time, there were hearings in which Republicans participated that ultimately brought the presidency down.
More than that, Republicans turned out to be, in some ways, some Republicans, the real heroes of Watergate. First of all, you had a 77-0 vote some Republicans abstained, but a unanimous vote of the Senate of the United States to create a real investigation, a real bipartisan investigation of presidential campaign activities, the Watergate Committee. You don't have anything like that kind of unanimity of purpose. And yes, many of
But it
those
was the Democratic the Democratic
Yes.
Senate that initiated that.
Yes,
Some Republicans joined in.
absolutely. And indeed, the senator who said, what did the president know and when did
Was
he?
a Republican.
Was a Republican, but he also was a Republican who the White House had picked to be in the bag, and in the beginning was in the bag. But he changed his mind, even though he was supposed to be in the bag and report back to the White House, Senator Baker.
Now, I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves because we don't know where this is going to go, but if there were, we do have investigations going on now. Do you have confidence that there are the Howard Bakers of the world, as the senator you're responding to, who
no,
are willing to,
I think,
is Richard Burr equivalent to Howard Baker?
I think the difference, the obvious difference today in the political equation is that the Republican Party has shown no willingness to date to question this president in a serious way about his lying, about these matters with Russia, that their silence has been deafening. And it's craven that these people will say to me in private, oh yeah, he's crazy. And then they won't say anything. Well, Corker has expressed some views about that, as have a few
primarily
others.
These views have been expressed by people who are either retiring or fighting mortal illness.
So there has, no, it's true. Look, the other thing is, we're a different country. Things happen in their own time. They really do. And yes, you can look at parallels and you can pick up on things that your ear pricks up and you say, oh my God. But we're a different country today. We are in a state of a cold civil war in this country today. And it didn't start with Donald Trump. Maybe Trump has brought us to the point of near ignition in this cold civil war. And we've had cultural wars going on now for 30 years.
Well, and let's be honest, Richard Nixon was one who exploited those cultural wars too in 1968 when he ran for president.
The Southern strategy that Richard Nixon initiated and the modern Republican Party taking over from the Democratic Party being a race-based, to some extent, looking at the idea that we can win white votes in the South. The Democrats, the Dixiecrats, for those of you who are old enough to know this or study ancient history, the Democrats had been the party of segregation in this country.
Yes.
And then, as the civil rights movement in the 60s and as the Democratic Party during the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration embraced civil rights, and the Southern Democrats who had controlled the Democratic Party started to lose their power, and white voters, Nixon invented this strategy to some extent.
In fact, if you look back at the...
But it's not just about race.
No, I understand. If you look back at that era, though, between the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, this great fissure between rural and urban communities over the war, over race, there are parallels. But I don't want to leave the investigation for 1 second. I have one more question on this, which is there's another dimension to this that didn't exist in this Watergate story, and that is this whole issue of money, personal money. And so there are two streams of this investigation. Right. One goes to was there or was there not collusion relative to the election, and the other are ancillary issues that go to were the Russians somehow involved in financial dealings.
The two can come together in terms of, we don't know this, but in terms of people being in the Trump campaign, people perhaps being susceptible to Russian entreaties because of the possibilities of financial gain. One of the things that's being investigated by Mueller are the Trump organization, Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, the Trump family's relationships, financial relationships to Russians, ethno-Russians, the businesses that ethno-Russians have been involved in, and how those businesses and individuals have interacted with those in the Trump organization, with perhaps Donald Trump, with Jared Kushner. That's a big part of this investigation, and we're going to have to see where it leads.
How much did
But you know, Nixon got up and famously said, "I am not a crook,"
which is not a good line if any of you are in a similar
Don't try
position.
it. Don't, and of course, what we do know, and I'm talking as a reporter here, we know as repertorial fact that Donald Trump is a grifter, that he has built his fortune to a large extent on manipulating and often cheating people in business, and the way he has conducted his business and filing lawsuits. This has not been the model. You know, he got up the other day and talked about how smart he was and that he had been to an Ivy League college, meaning and he'd gone to Penn and the Wharton School.
A lesser institution.
But whatever the case, these were not business ethics classes that he was getting A's in. I don't think.
So do you feel that this is the most interesting element of the investigation?
No, I think I think it's one story. I think it's one story including the stability of the President of the United States or fitness of the United States. I think all of these strands are coming together. Now, as a legal matter, does the question of the stability of the President of the United States come into this? And I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not about to pronounce him anything, but I'm struck by, again, how many Republicans, intelligence people, and military people are concerned about the stability of the President of the United States, and that we seem to be reading almost every day about a kind of military protectorate that we have around the President of the United States in these three generals. But I see all of these things coming together, including the lying by the President of the United States. That the money, you know, follow the money, follow the lies. The connections with Russians and ethno-Russians, what we are seeing about attempts to get, quote, dirt from the Russians on Hillary Clinton.
That's
And
a phrase that's come up in several different contexts.
well, all along. Yeah. And of course, what did the Russians want more than anything else? The end of sanctions. And particularly the Magnitsky.
Say it 3 times.
Say it 3 times.
Yes.
Sanctions, even more than the others.
These were sanctions that were placed on Russians who were deemed to have been involved in human rights violations.
That's right.
And ones that particularly irk Vladimir Putin.
That's exactly right. So there's a whole umbrella here that I think we need to be looking at everything under the umbrella, and we are. And the other thing is, you are seeing a renaissance far beyond Watergate of great reporting in this story by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by Mother Jones, by CNN, by the Wall Street Journal. What we are seeing
How much is the
here,
reporting leading the investigation, and how much is the reporting of the investigation?
it's both. I think that there is an awful lot of original reporting that is not coming from investigators, but is coming from the kind of thing
the Times broke the story about the June meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort and these Russian apparatchiks.
I think that I don't want to go to where sources are. That had been known to a congressional committee.
But not apparently to the prosecutors, or at least that's as
I think that's probably correct.
Yeah.
What you see is that what we did, that look, Watergate was about the American system working. The press did its job. You see what we did. We were early. We got out there. We did what you're supposed to do.
The Congress did its job.
That's the next thing. The judiciary, a great judge, Sirica, who had the Watergate burglars in his courtroom, and he had read what we were writing. And we and Cy Hirsch in the Times had written a story saying that the Watergate burglars were being paid for their silence. And Sirica used all these stories we had written in his courtroom to get the burglars to finally admit there was a cover-up going on. And incidentally, there is no question there is a cover-up going on in the White House. We just don't know what is being covered up. We'll find out. We're beginning to find out. But there's no question that Trump has been trying to keep investigators from learning all kinds of things since he's become president.
Well, let me, I want to take questions from the audience, but I want to ask you a more general question about, I was one of the young reporters who was inspired by what you did. I'm not trying to date you.
That's
but,
okay.
But when I was here, I worked with
him. White.
Yes. All right. Okay, so you got me back. There were a whole generation of reporters who were inspired by this because of the power of what you and Bob did to help uncover what was a scandal of historic magnitude. Obviously, the movie made you guys great celebrities, and that probably was something that enticed a bunch of young reporters, and we all want to be movie stars, of course. But my question to you is this: it's also true that from that point on, there was this sense that as a young reporter, you earned your spurs by finding corruption, by toppling people in positions of power. And I guess my question to you is, has that been an unalloyed good?
No, because that's not what the function of reporters is. I mean, I come back to this very basic definition of the best obtainable version of the truth. Whether you're covering sports, you're covering business, you're covering the city council, you're covering a university, it all comes down to that. And the best obtainable version of the truth is about context, among other things. And it's not the job of a reporter or a publisher or an editor to bring about a desired political result. It's to get the information out there, and then the culture has to deal with it. The larger culture has to deal with the information. Obviously, the biggest question we have as journalists in many ways is, what is news? Well, look what Fox thinks is news. Look what the rest of us might think is news. But no, and I wrote a cover piece for the New Republic. It's on my website in '92, I believe, called "The Triumph of Idiot Culture." And what it was about...
Way ahead of your time there.
Well, it was about the Murdochization of the American press to a large extent. And it was about the growing dominance and carryover to mainstream news organizations of manufactured controversy, sensationalism, gossip. And of all things, the lead of the piece was about Donald Trump. The lead of the piece is Diane Sawyer, who is a very capable journalist, but this was how far it had gone by 1992. Diane Sawyer saying to Marla Maples, "Marla, was it really the best sex you ever had?" And that was the lead of this piece about the triumph of idiot culture, meaning that taking what we do as reporters and thinking this is what we're about. But one of the things that's so interesting, of course, is Donald Trump, fake news, attacking the press, enemies of the people. He is a creation of the press. He is a creation of the New York tabloids. He
But
better,
also a master of
and him and John Barron. John Barron is the name Trump took for himself to call in a somewhat articulated, re-articulated voice that fooled no one. Hey, did you hear what Donald Trump did last night at Studio 54? Who was it on the phone? It was Donald Trump. And this went on for years. But Trump's manipulation of the New York Post and the New York Daily News made him, really, as a celebrity, and he is probably the greatest example of celebrity culture that we have had.
I raised the question because it does concern me that your assessment of what good reporting is completely consonant with mine, which is you try and find out what the facts are and report them. And you should not start with a mission of trying to, you shouldn't be in search of scandal before the facts lead you to that place. And I assume that we can find out the answer to Diane Sawyer's question of Marla Maples on your website?
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
All right. We'll take some questions from the audience, and I want going to take students first. So I'm not going to check your ID. You look legit.
Want to tell us your name, though?
Hi. Is this working at all?
No.
Should I just hold it?
Is it? It comes to me. Oh, it comes to him.
Comes to you.
Just
Okay.
speak up
Wonderful.
because that doesn't project in the room.
Got you. So my name is Kyle Shishkin, and I want to thank you first of all for your time. It's been a really wonderful experience. This kind of a question is doomed to come up on the University of Chicago grounds, and that is ultimately, what is your stance on freedom of expression in the press, and whether you think there should ever be some rational restraints to it?
Should there
And
be?
in what-
Can you all?
and in what
you can't
context?
hear it. It was
Yes,
what you
go
want to
ahead.
repeat it?
No, you repeat it, and then answer it.
Talked about campuses and freedom of the press and whether there should ever be constraints on freedom of the press. Is that?
And of expression.
And of expression. I'm pretty much a strict constitutionalist on this question. I think, except for, the classic yelling fire in a crowded theater, I think people get to say whatever they want to say. And an idea that there is some kind of constrained speech that is acceptable on campus in a public forum is a very slippery slope that I would not go down. And I realize that offensive things are said to all kinds of people, but I think that the price of if anything distinguishes us as a people, in our history, it's the First Amendment to the Constitution about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and you don't mess with it.
Freedom of the press.
Well, yeah, freedom of the press.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Ian. I'm a second year in the college. So one of the issues that has come up a lot since the 2016 election has been...
Speak a little louder. We won't have to repeat it, I think.
So one of the issues that's come up a lot since the 2016 election is the coverage during the election of Hillary Clinton's emails and whether that was over-covered by the media and something that kind of negatively affected her campaign. And so I was wondering what your opinion was on that, and should the press be kind of holding themselves to a higher standard and doing a better job in that aspect?
Well, I was one of those on the air who was quite tough about the question of Hillary Clinton's emails, or certainly her truthfulness, among other things, about how she dealt with the subject. And also the idea that there was real recklessness in having a private server in the basement of the home of the Secretary of State in terms of national security. So I don't think the press overplayed the story by and large during the primaries. I don't think it certainly didn't inhibit her ability to become the nominee of the party to the point where she did not become the nominee. I think it was a legitimate story. I think there then came a kind of equivalency when Donald Trump became the nominee and started yelling crooked Hillary. And then in the press, we began covering these two things as if his lying was anything comparable, that his just continued lying and his actions were even in the same category as hers. So that we devoted so much time to covering his accusations against her. What was terrible in the coverage of this election was that there was not on any cable news or major network channel a single biographical, substantive documentary on any of the candidates, and not anything approaching an investigative biography on any of the candidates while they were seeking the nomination. Not on Trump, not on Hillary, not on Sanders. A lack of reporting that was just astonishing. Partly on the, I think the mindset is, oh yeah, we know about Hillary. She's been around for 25 years, 30 years. We know about Donald Trump. Yeah, we'll do a little reporting on Bernie Sanders. Not a single investigative biography. And you then take a terrible abdication of responsibility. And then you take the free airtime accorded Donald Trump because it was a circus such as we had never seen that attracted so many viewers. And people understandably wanted to watch this circus. But yet the question that I keep raising about what is it we do, what is news, is the most basic thing we do. And that was not news, having a television camera at an airport focused on the crowd a half hour before Trump got there, and reporters sitting there saying he's going to be here in 20 minutes.
Well, not to mention the hour of coverage. I mean, his great insight is that if you're willing to light yourself on fire, it's good TV, and he continues to understand that to this day.
He understands the culture, and he understood a lot of things in his campaign that your party did not understand.
I'm here as the director of the Institute of Politics, not as a representative. I just want to make one point on this, and then I will take another question. And that is, I do think that Hillary suffered from the presumption that she was going to be elected. And she was covered as someone whose election was presumed. And therefore, her liabilities were covered more seriously. Trump was covered more as a sideshow for a lot of that election. And, I think that she suffered for that, not excusing the way she handled it, which I think was poor. I think she was the victim of the presumption of her own victory. Yeah.
My name is Spencer. I'm a first year in the college. Sorry. It seems like less so on this story, but more on kind of national security reporting, surveillance reporting. There's more of a fracturing in terms of who's doing the reporting. Less Washington Post, New York Times, more like open source leaking, or people are founding things like The Intercept. My question is, do you think that is, broadly speaking, a good thing, or do you think that is just more of a risk in terms of lower reporting standards or questions of credibility or anything like that?
It's a difficult question to parse. Tell me if I'm stating it fairly. That you called it a fracturing of reporting, meaning that we no longer have just a few mainstream news organizations, and we now have, particularly you said on national security reporting, we have reporting such as The Intercept, which comes out of the Snowden revelations, Glenn Greenwald. I don't know how much I think where we're going with this question is, where do you want to go with it? Beyond
I mean, what does it? Let me take your question and add to it. Does this multiplicity of sources add to the quality of reporting, or does it just create a lot of
and it's
of
really,
noise?
the good news is obviously that we have many more sources beyond 5 great news organizations, traditional newspapers that have become more on the web, 3 networks, the cable news, the mainstream news, plus we now have dozens of news, in quote, organizations reporting from different perspectives, point of views. It's a good thing, but it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing in the sense...
You sound like a politician.
Yeah, well, the bad aspect of this is how difficult it makes it. The great thing about the best of the old mainstream news organizations is that no matter how bad some of our coverage has been at various times, there really is a consistent belief in that ideal of the best obtainable version of the truth. I think it really has guided organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post.
And a layer of editors like Ben Bradley and the others who you dealt
exactly.
with. Exactly,
And there's a
policemen.
tradition, and that's continued into the internet age in terms of these. It's not an accident that, you know, that the websites on which we're seeing a lot of these stories include the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. We also see Mother Jones. We also see some stuff in The Intercept, in all kinds of publications. But we also have numerous organizations that call themselves news organizations that have nothing to do with the best obtainable version of the truth, that really are looking for information that advances their preconceived notions of what people ought to believe in. And Fox is, by and large, not altogether, but by and large, an example of it. But let's talk about
It's a good business model.
Yeah, it's a good business model. Maybe it's a good business. Look,
They make a lot of money.
They make a lot of money, but also let's be deadly serious about Fox. It's the most important force that has changed American politics in the last 30 years. Am I right about this?
Yeah, 50% of Republicans say that's where they get
So
their news.
that is a huge cultural change. It's not just about the news, it's about culture. And one of the things that we keep doing is keeping the focus on the press and how we're doing without looking at the larger culture and the citizenry. Now, I can't make a metric that will tell you what the numbers are here, but I know I'm right about the following. That far more people, a percentage of our people today, are looking for news and information to buttress what they already believe, to reinforce their political, religious, and cultural beliefs, and are not open to the best obtainable version of the truth. And I would say, my feeling is that may be more significant than the failures of the press, that we have a failure of the citizenry, that we do not, at the time of Watergate, we had a political culture as well as a larger culture that was open. It might have taken a while, but it was, people were not dug in to the extent that they would not look at a set of facts that were put in front of them that were pretty clear and say, oh yeah, this adds up to 5. Huge difference.
Let us be fair about this, too. That siloing doesn't just happen on the right. It happens.
Totally.
We have virtual reality communities in which people share views, and people outside the line are viewed.
There may be a somewhat asymmetrical aspect to this, but this goes all across the board. And the other terrible aspect of this in terms of this is how you have a cold civil war, is when you cannot have a fact-based debate. We cannot have a fact-based debate in our culture today. Again, I would say it's asymmetrical if you have one group of people that won't believe in science. But asymmetrical or not, look at the greatest debate in our country's history. Let's look at the Federalist Debate. Vitriolic, nasty, but they could agree on the landscape, on an existential plane in front of them of what the facts were that they were debating and bringing their philosophies to. We cannot have that debate today. We cannot have a debate at the dinner table. Now, not all of us, but what is becoming a cultural norm, not Washington, the country. A cultural norm is an inability to have a fact-based contextual debate.
Yeah, although, yes, but, you know, whatever happened, these investigations notwithstanding, the concern I have is that, you know, when the president himself encourages the idea that that facts are fungible, and that and dismisses as fake reporting that he doesn't.
Absolutely.
That is unflattering. That's dangerous. Can I have a
but
question?
wait one second. One sec. I agree with you 100%. But this situation existed before Donald Trump got there.
No, I
that
fully
he has taken it to the point of lighting the match.
Are there women here who want to? Yes.
I'm Madeline. I'm a first year in the college. My question was, given the prevalence and rise of alternative facts with Donald Trump's presidency, with our current administration, how do we get back to a government that has respect for facts?
How I tend to think that, look, Washington is, I'm born and raised in Washington. Washington, yes, it exists in a bubble. It has its own peculiarities, its own ethic, its own all kinds of bywords and language and one thing and another, but it is also a reflection of the country. And I'm interested if you agree with that, but I don't think this is about government. I think we are at a cultural moment here. This is about the country. This is not about government. This is about who we are as a people, what we believe in, how we relate to each other, what we read, what we learn in our schools, what goes on in our communities. Not about government, particularly not about government in Washington. This is that really Washington is a reflection. What you see going on in Washington, in the Congress, for instance, is a reflection of the country.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Well, I do, and the point you're making is that what's going on in the larger country, at least as it reflects in our politics, makes it very difficult to govern. And the answer to your question is sort of rooted in what Carl said earlier, which is it will only change if, in a democracy, the only way it changes is if people demand something else. And, you know, and I think that the great challenge is in the media environment in which we live, in this siloed world in which we tend to choose sources of information that affirm our point of view instead of informing our point of view. Can citizens summon up the wherewithal to break out of those silos and demand a fact-based debate? That's a big question. Yeah, more questions.
Can I get a water from up there? You got a water up there? Thanks. You want water?
Yes. No. No water. Yes
One
to
water,
the
yes question.
yes to the question.
So I read that Nixon was actually an intellectually astute man, finishing the third in his class from Duke University. But Donald Trump was something different. He was known as not only intellectually uncurious, but also he writes on this wave of intellectualism because people feel they are not respected by the intellectual, by the educated. So my question is, how could our day-to-day, person-to-person discourse remedy this toxic, polarized public discourse in the backdrop that lots of people vote for Trump just because of this discontent towards intellectual hubris? How should the solution be when the solution itself has become part of the problem?
It's a long question that was premised on Nixon. You started off by saying he was astute and well, intimating that he was well read and well educated, and you contrasted that by saying essentially that Trump was not. Trump is educated. I mean, he got an education, but Trump is spectacularly ignorant. There's no question about his ignorance of our history, of things going on in the world. It's quite astonishing that a president of the United States, that's not to say he's not smart. I would never go there and say he's not smart. But in terms of ignorance of what has gone on before and even yesterday in the country and the world, yeah. But then your question went to about how can
we not be intellectually too proud to communicate with people on the other side?
so you're
It's about how do we break down the divide between elites
right.
and people
incidentally,
who feel assailed by elites.
right. And incidentally, I think one of the things Trump did in this campaign is he really articulated something that nobody else did about the failure of elites. I think there's some pretty demonstrable truth to the failure of the so-called elites over the last 40 years. If you look at what institutions in our country really have been working over the past 25, 30 years, you might say the military, you might say tech, you might say the entertainment business. I don't know how many institutions you would say really do function well after that. So Donald Trump's analysis of some things, I think, was more acute. Whatever prejudices it might have appealed to in some ways, whatever the nativism, whatever the latent or not so latent racism of aspects of the campaign, the misogyny, all the rest, nonetheless, there's some really acute things that were observed by candidate Trump.
Fundamentally, that our institutions often work in favor of elites.
That's right. And also that the elites have failed us. I think there's something to that. But to your question, how do we rise above this and become the country we were, if you're talking about in terms of person-to-person comity and respect for points of view? And I don't know. I'm going to give. I really want to know what David thinks about this too.
Well, look, I'm just going to say this.
Let me just say one thing here. I have always.
You don't really want to know what I think, do you?
I do. No, I want to know what I do. But I've always been an optimist about the country until recently. And my only real optimism stems from the time I spend with young people.
Yeah.
And that has convinced me that in terms of policy, what you're talking about, what can we do? I think there's one thing that can change us as a country and might offer some hope over generations. Compulsory national service for every 18-year-old in this country. You can go into the forestry service for a year and a half, go into the military, work in a hospital. In the Vietnam era, I'm not proud of my military service because I tried to avoid the draft, so I went into the reserves. But my experience—
You could be president of the United States.
My experience in boot camp in the Army is seminal in my life. Being thrown together with a group of people different from your own backgrounds with a common purpose, kicking ass, and it can be really transforming.
Right.
And so I think
I think
national service is the one transformative idea I can think of for the country.
Well, and I think that there was something about our politics in the post-war era that resulted from people from different backgrounds serving in one common cause. I agree with you. I probably have time for now. I'm being told
But
one
you
more.
didn't answer. Go ahead, answer the. I want to know what about how you see the future.
Well,
politically,
first of all,
culturally.
I agree with you about young people. It's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I'm inspired. I'm inspired by young people, but I also believe that there is a cyclical nature to our politics, and I'm interested to see what the reaction to the Trump era is, because we can go one of two ways. We can try and replicate Trump. The left can try and replicate Trump and match his anger, and win its base, or someone could emerge and try and appeal to the values that we do share, the concerns that we do share as a country, without ignoring the differences that we have. I believe that very well may be the next turn of the page, but we shall see. I have time for one more question. I'm still prioritizing students here. Yeah, this young man.
Hi, I'm Nick. I'm a first year, and I'd like to start off by saying just thank you so much for coming here. It's been incredible to be able to share this dialogue with you. So you mentioned earlier how many news organizations are having leakers come to them and present leaks to them, whereas during the Watergate scandal, it was much more of a vigorous investigation where you had to fight for leaks. And so oftentimes comparisons are drawn between Trump and Nixon, and I'm wondering, what does the disorganization in the White House and the eagerness of leakers of this White House compared to the Nixon White House tell you about their leadership styles?
The end of the question is, what is the Nixon White House compared to the disorganization of this White House tell us
I think
about
it's in terms of leakers.
why is there leadership
such a,
style, and then
you guys pulled a lot of this reporting out,
right, without leaks.
But there seems to be a proliferation of people who are willing to talk about Donald Trump. Many of them within his own administration.
I think that reporters are doing much of the same kind of thing that we did. That they are going to sources in the White House. A lot. We're seeing the New York Times especially, but also the Washington Post, the reporting out of the White House, and CNN. There's some great reporting coming out of the White House because people in the White House are approachable. If you go, let's talk for a minute about what you see up there in All the President's Men. You see a couple of reporters who go to people open-minded, who respect the people they're covering. We didn't have sources in the opposite party. You didn't see any Democrats we talked to up there. I think reporters particularly need to be better listeners and more respectful of the people they cover. And one of the reasons we're seeing such good reporting, one of the reasons Donald Trump today called Maggie Haberman to the New York Times is, and Trump might hate the New York Times, but he knows that Maggie Haberman is a good reporter who is respectful on a personal level of the people she covers, who is not coming in there and using a lot of elbows and with a predisposed notion of what the story is she's going to write. She's open to being a great listener and hearing. Reporters need to be better listeners. And you see it more in local news reporting because it's right in front of you. You see all the time a reporter with a microphone throw it in front of somebody with the idea not of illuminating what's underneath, of getting to the deeper story, but to manufacture controversy. So that is in some way my answer to your question. You also talked about the two leadership styles. Interestingly enough, Nixon was a president, and we know now from the tapes, who said wild, outrageous things and gave wild, outrageous orders, including 1 year to the day before the Watergate break-in. You hear him on the tape about some documents that are in a safe in the Brookings Institution in Washington that relate to the Vietnam War and would make his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, look worse on the war than Nixon looks. And next to Nixon in the Oval Office during this conversation is Henry Kissinger, the great national security advisor, Mr. Haldeman, and Nixon says, I want those documents in the safe at Brookings. Crack that safe, break in, firebomb the goddamn place. I don't care. 1 year to the day, Nixon does this. Kissinger says not a word. Haldeman says not a word. For the next 13 days, Nixon keeps saying, what about this Brookings thing? Did we crack the safe yet? He is deadly serious. Finally, John Dean, I believe it is, goes out to
White House counsel.
Yeah, the White House counsel, John Dean, goes out to the Western White House in San Clemente and tells people around the president, you have to stop this because the president wants to break into the Brookings Institution. And Haldeman, of all things, we know from his diaries, and we hear it on the tapes, constantly saw a good part of his job, much the way we are hearing Kelly and McMaster described. Keep the president from doing dangerous things. Though, again, the intellectual firepower, there's no comparison between the two presidents. So if you're talking, though, about the atmosphere in the White House, the Nixon White House was not a lot of fun. And the President of the United States was constantly ordering terrible, outrageous things.
But here's the difference, and this goes to your point. There is contemporaneous reporting going on out of the White House constantly about Donald Trump's moods, about some of his, outrageous suggestions and so on. And the question is, why now? Why? The answer is, Richard Nixon had people around him who had been with him for a long time and had some personal loyalty to him. The Donald Trump team, by and large, are a bunch of people other than relatives who are new to him, who don't feel that same level of loyalty to him. And I think, as Carl mentioned earlier, like some of the members of Congress, may have some concerns about him, and maybe concerns for themselves. So I think it's created an environment in which good reporters can find people who will be much more forthcoming with them about contemporaneous events in the White House than you were able to find in the era of Nixon.
There's also, I think here at the end of the discussion, we're coming to some interesting conclusions. And one is what the Watergate reporting did do. There had been, up until the Watergate break-in, there had been this whole idea of the new Nixon, that the Washington press corps believed this idea that Nixon had changed from a kind of backstreet fighter, political fighter, into this statesman, and that he really had become a kind of clean hands guy, and substantive as Nixon might have been, and he's written some fascinating books, great political analyst, he still was a real street fighter. And yet this myth of the new Nixon...
Fundamentally, by the way, also a guy who believed that the elites were against him.
And Nixon was paranoid. Nixon's paranoia is so extreme, and was But the press, the Washington press corps, had bought into this idea until the Watergate reporting of the new Nixon. And also there had been a tradition of reporting on presidents. Look at what we know about Kennedy now in terms of his personal life that we didn't know at the time we were covering him. That now we have a healthy, I think, not cynicism, but we cover the institution with realism and some healthy skepticism about what we're dealing with human beings. And also, the White House also is a reflection of the larger culture. In good times, maybe of the best of who we are. In bad times, maybe of the worst.
Well, Carl, I can't thank you enough for being with us and for the extraordinary work you've done over a long period of time. It was fun and a little bit chilling to relive this history with you in the context of today. But thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.